So it's basically like Cal Dietz and Verkhoshansky had a baby. What is the rationale for concentrating on these different contraction types? Well, if you read Triphasic by Cal Dietz, the theory goes that each of these contraction types or muscle actions occupies a different area of the brain. It can be considered a separate skill. And of course, if we concentrate on things in isolation, the pieces of the whole, and we optimally develop each of those, the idea is that when we reintegrate them into the whole benefits. Hey guys, what's up? This is Keir from strengthcoachnetwork.com. If you have been following along, you'll know that the other day we started a 3-part reaction series on the training of Werner Günthör, who is a 3-time world champion in the shot put. If you have not seen part 1 of this series, go ahead and click the card so you can go back and watch that video, because we're going to be talking about the continuation and progression of some concepts in this video that were discussed in part 1. If you have seen that video though, let's crack on with part 2. And remember, the videos that we are covering in this series is completely up to you. If there is a video that you would like a reaction to, some comments on, it can be a team, an athlete, anything that's out there, drop a comment below and we'll get it lined up in the series. And of course, as usual, please placate the algorithm gods. Like, comment, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. With that said, let's talk about what the overall theme of today's video is going to be. If you recall, in the previous installment, we talked about this pyramid structure of training. We are trying to build the widest base possible in the earlier stages that we can build a higher peak later on down the line. So in part 1, we found ourselves in the general extensive phase. So generally speaking, exercises that look more dissimilar than similar to the competition exercise, the shot put, using a greater variety of movements that may be a piece of the whole rather than an integrated whole, and generally speaking, exercises with more structural adaptations for higher volumes and lower intensity in the grand scheme of things. Now that that base has been built, we're ready to start building on top of that to achieve a peak. You are going to see exercises in this video which are progressively more similar to the competition exercise according to the criteria of dynamic correspondence that we talked about in the previous video. You're also going to see progressively more intensity used for less variety, less volume, and more integrated. That is to say, we're not targeting specific weak links in the chain. We're starting to look at movements in their entirety and concern ourselves more with neural adaptations and the outputs that the athlete is capable of, rather than these structural or tissue adaptations. So straight away, you can see that the balance beam exercises are gone. There's obviously going to be less stability and balance demands to the exercises being used in this phase compared to the general extensive phase. That of course means that the forces he's capable of producing are going to go up. And we're also going to see this contrast pairing where if he is doing these control exercises, for example, with the barbell in the circle, it's being paired with an explosive exercise, presumably to kind of like lock in that kinesthetic feel, cement technique, concentrate on sequencing, and generally make sure that everything is transferring to the competition event. What we're seeing as well is use of shot puts that are above and below competition load. If you use the Bondarchuk classification, this would be considered the competition exercise. That is to say, the most specific thing that you can do other than the event itself. And when we go overweight, we're obviously trying to address the force production aspect of the competition exercise. And when we go over speed, we're obviously trying to train the speed. So of course, highly specific, we're seeing that progression from more general exercises in phase 1 to phase 2. So next up, we have this pretty diagram of the 3 contraction types: isometric, concentric, eccentric. And then we have these I would say like Verkhoshansky terms in between. So the statodynamic in the concentric, the statodynamic in the eccentric, and the plyometric action. And I would say, just to simplify this, it's basically overcoming loads from a dead stop yielding to loads with a dead stop, and then just these very, very fast actions where we're concentrating on minimization of amortization and switching from eccentric to concentric as fast as possible. So it's basically like Cal Dietz and Verkhoshansky had a baby. What is the rationale for concentrating on these different contraction types? Well, if you read Triphasic by Cal Dietz, the theory goes that each of these contraction types or muscle actions occupies a different area of the brain. It can be considered a separate skill. And of course, if we concentrate on things in isolation, the pieces of the whole, and we optimally develop each of those, the idea is that when we reintegrate them into the whole benefits. So you can see from the weight room exercises, we have these different muscular regimes being paired together in a contrast fashion. So the statodynamic that you can see in the first exercise being paired with a light load jump squat in the second exercise. We know by definition that the contrast method is an advanced training method. It's a potent stimulus to the central nervous system. That is why the Soviets used it for one, and they waited for quite a while before they used it because of the stress and the intensity of the stimulus associated with that. Clearly, we are seeing a progression from the pre-fatigue single joint bodybuilding type work in part one of this series, and now we're getting to still general exercises according to that criteria, but more intense for sure in phase two. Interestingly enough, I've seen other coaches say before that there's a big difference between isometric contraction and isometric overload. So just because he's doing these long holds, I think of all of the different actions that are being used here, this is probably the weakest. It probably has the least amount of carryover. Maybe there is an advantage there from joint angle specific adaptations or some kind of kinesthetic awareness or increasing time under tension. But really, when you're dealing with an athlete of this size and this level of strength, holding for 10 seconds, 3 plates and a back squat, I'm not sure what the overload is going to be. But you can see from the apparatus being used earlier in the video, they have this pneumatic Smith machine. Certainly, there is a lot of ability there to overload isometric contraction, the eccentric and the concentric using this apparatus. Very ahead of its time, considering this is like 30 years ago, and Louis Simmons is marketing something like this now as cutting edge. Small disagreement, they call it a plyometric muscle action, where you see that he has submaximal loads in the bench press. He's got this really fast reversal speed, but we know by definition an exercise is probably not a plyometric, and it's probably not recruiting heavily the stretch shortening cycle unless the contact time associated with that movement is less than 250 milliseconds. So it's fast. Is it plyometric? No, it's not. Now, if you recall, in the previous video, we talked about this accidental observational study they did into Werner and his twin. And the main effect that they observed from his training program was this massive preferential hypertrophy of fast twitch fiber relative to slow twitch fiber. So although his fiber type distribution was a straight 50-50, by the time he got to his prime in his career, he was almost 70 to 80% fast twitch fiber by cross-sectional area. And the training that you're seeing in this video is what we can most attribute those changes to. If you look at the loads being used, if you look at the intent going into each rep, and you look at the management of fatigue, you can see that this is what is going to tap into those high threshold motor units and stimulate those to adapt from what we know from Henneman's size principle. And interestingly enough, when I put up phase one, I was contacted by a Swiss coach who told me that he's interacted with Jean-Pierre Egger since, and he said since the production of this video, one of the major things that he has evolved on in his own philosophy is the avoidance of high reps and failure and very high volumes for this reason. So he told me that actually now in the general phase, the hypertrophy work, he prefers to train with clusters for this very reason. So now we get to the sexy part of the video that I'm sure most people who have ever heard of Werner Günthör have seen this video. This is his crazy contrast plyometric training session. Bear in mind, when you see these exercises, this guy is 6'7" and anywhere from 120 to 140 kilos. So when you see the speed of movement involved, you also have to factor in the sheer amount of mass that he's overcoming with this. So if you recall, we said in part one of this series, there's a real emphasis on isolation and attacking weak links in the chain. When you execute things as an integrated whole, there is a tendency for athletes to only play to their strengths and avoid weaknesses. And if you don't start to break things down and tackle them in isolation, you might never raise a limiting factor within a system. Yes, there is going to be progressively more integration in this intensive phase, but remember, it's still general phase, and you do still see some isolation in terms of the plyometric training here. So we see him jumping up the stadium stairs, so that would be a concentric focus, but he also pairs this with a descending series down the stairs, concentrating on the landing, presumably concentrating on the eccentric muscle action or the braking action of jumping. So all of the characteristics of the extensive plyometrics from the previous video are now gone. This is now textbook intensive plyometric training. Still using broadly the same exercises, but the shoes are on, the ground reaction forces are up, the surface is stiffer, the intent is there, the reps per set, and presumably the total number of contacts per session have gone down. We can see a pairing of a resistance exercise with a plyometric exercise. And if you pay attention to this video, you can see that the resistance training exercise being used would have a fairly good amount of dynamic correspondence to the jump being used. So in the stadium jumps, we see that deeper hip and knee angle, that longer contact time, and it would generally be considered a more kind of like quad and hip dominant jump being paired with a squat. When we see the hurdle bounds and the ankle pops, it's being paired with a barbell calf raise. We see the lateral squat being paired with the zigzag bounds. And we also see the Bulgarian split squat being paired with the horizontal bounding. I'm not really sure about the scientific rationale for this kind of like smorgasbord of all of these different exercises being paired together that you see. It's a lot of contacts. It's very complex. I would not feel confident doing this with team sport athletes just because there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. But to witness it is just incredible. A guy of this size being able to achieve this speed of movement, these outputs, when you see him fly up these stadium stairs, it really does provide context for you that there are levels to the game. Powerful, fast, explosive athletes in team sports, that's one thing. When you get to the stopwatch sports, especially track and field, I would say, for me, throwers are unquestionably the most explosive athletes I've ever trained in my career and probably the most fun next to team sport athletes. Lastly, finishing up, you see this pendulum apparatus that he's using. This is a great example of what Werner would call the shock method. The shock method, there is some carryover to plyometric training, but it basically goes like this. The brain is extremely clever, and if you put it in situations where it can put on the brakes to protect itself from future damage, it will do so. So there is a limit to the amount of stimulation that we can expose the central nervous system to with a loaded barbell, for example, or even loaded jumps. Load it up heavy enough, and eventually you're going to start to put the brakes on because you know that if you drop down really, really fast with a heavy load, there's the potential for risk. So the reason that the shock method and things like depth jumps is a thing is that if I throw you off a box, whether you like it or not, you are going to hit the ground at 9.81 meters per second, and there is going to be a massive ground reaction force on contact. You get this huge recruitment of the stretch shortening cycle, and you get much more force production than would be capable under volitional conditions, and a huge stimulus to the central nervous system. This is why the subsequent jump height is going to be higher for a counter movement jump relative to a jump with a pause, and a depth jump is going to result in a higher jump height than a counter movement jump again. It's also the reason why depth jumps are considered to be such an intensive training means and take so long to recover from. And in reality, the Soviets used the shock method not as a tool to train recruitment or utilization of the stretch shortening cycle. They actually use it as a central nervous system stimulation tool. And this is why they were able to observe increases in 1RM strength or activities in which there was no stretch shortening cycle, even after using the shock method. That concept is being applied here in the upper body with the pendulum apparatus. If you consider that when he pushes the pendulum forward, there's an amount of potential energy at the top that he is having to absorb. I know we don't say absorb force because you can't absorb force. He is having to decelerate, and he's getting a counter movement in his upper body that he would not be able to do under volitional conditions. And that means that there's going to be a subsequently greater concentric force on the way back as we recruit the stretch shortening cycle through his upper body. So this is a great example of upper body shock training if you've never seen it before. Great example of this, and a good place to wind up part 2 of this series. So what we're going to see in the final installment of this series, there's actually 2 videos on YouTube, but I'm going to cram them together because it lasts about 8 to 10 minutes. We're going to look at the specific phase, the explosive training, basically the realization of all of this adaptation in the context of sporting form. So if you enjoyed this video, please help us placate the algorithm gods, like, subscribe, share, comment. And again, if there's any other videos that you would like to see in this series, drop us a comment below and we'll get it lined up. Thanks. Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thanks.